Hello again, everyone. Brian Allred, teaching pastor at New Life Presbyterian Church in Yorktown, and welcome back to our series on learning to love Leviticus. Hope you don't mind that I'm moving the circle around a little bit. Sometimes it's on the side, sometimes at the bottom, and now I moved it at the top for starting the lesson. But just for a little variety here, as we move into a new section, actually provided some introductory lessons for the new section on instructions for purity as we continue to cover the terrain on step 2 in our attempt. This is why I don't have it at the top. I should keep it at the bottom so it doesn't obscure the title. But we have entered into this new section on instructions for purity. Again, kind of provided an overview the last couple sessions, and now we get into the details in chapter 11. Remember that there is a 3-step approach to learning to love Leviticus. I have proposed that we begin with understanding the context of Leviticus in the Bible, the redemptive context and the literary context. We covered that very early, and then we moved into understanding the content. And that will take up, obviously, a good portion of our time as we look at the teachings and instructions that we find in the 27 chapters in the book. And again, we have arrived at chapter 11, which has to do with the dietary code or the food laws. And so what we're going to look at in today's lesson is eat this, not that, from Leviticus 11. I'm probably violating some kind of trademark policy because eat this, not that, you may have heard of before is an organization that promotes healthy eating habits on the web. You could look them up and actually have a lot of good information. But it seemed to be appropriate as a title for Leviticus chapter 11, as God is giving his people instructions that allow them or permit them to eat certain kinds of food as clean and prohibit them from eating other kinds of food, which is rendered unclean. And so we might wonder what the significance of this is for Israel to be allowed to eat certain food and not allowed to eat different kinds of food. But maybe even more immediately, we wonder what the chapter has to do with us and how it's relevant for us as Christians specifically today. And that's a fair question. Let me say, I guess, first of all, that this idea of cleanliness related to food and even the idea of food laws shouldn't really be all that foreign to us. Certainly if we read through Leviticus chapter 11, which we're not going to do as part of the video lesson. So again, I would encourage you to make sure before or during the time that you're watching these lessons on YouTube, primarily probably preferentially before you watch them, that you would read through the chapter since we're not taking time to do that on the video. But as you read through Leviticus chapter 11, you might think that it doesn't connect very well to our contemporary times, that we don't have anything analogous to food laws and cleanliness as it relates to food, which of course would not be true at all because we do. Just think about all the health department codes that have to be followed and all of the health department violations that we read about in the paper that restaurants get written up on all the time because they're not practicing proper cleanliness as it relates to food. But not just in terms of keeping food clean. Of course, there's all kinds of expiration dates that are part of federal regulations in our grocery stores. And so there's an awful lot of protections that are in place and laws specifically that are in place for food cleanliness and things of that nature. And also when you think about categorizing certain foods as clean and unclean, you look at Leviticus chapter 11 and you think, well, that seems really foreign, it seems really strange, we don't have anything like that. Well, of course we have things like that. They tend to be more cultural, but sometimes they're still religious in nature. If you think of the Hindu restriction on eating beef from cows, things of that nature, ongoing restrictions among Jews for eating pigs, bacon, pork, anything like that. But even in our culture that's been dominated by Christianity historically, where we don't really think of foods as being absolutely prohibited for reasons of faith or spirituality, we do have kind of cultural prohibitions against eating certain kinds of foods. For example, if I ask you if you've ever eaten horse, you would probably say no, and many of you would think that that's disgusting and inappropriate to eat horse. to ratchet that example up a little bit more, if I asked you if you had ever eaten dog, many of you, I would guess, maybe most of you, would be even more offended to think that it would be appropriate to eat dog because we just don't think that that's fitting, that those are not animals that should be eaten for food. And so we've kind of categorized them as unclean, even if we haven't used that word. They are off limits for us. And so we shouldn't think of this idea of clean and unclean foods as alien and foreign as we often do. But the question is still relevant. How is this chapter on Levitical dietary laws important for us to consider? Especially since we know that the specific laws that we see in the book of Leviticus are neither universal. In other words, they're not for all the nations. They are specific to Israel. And neither are these dietary laws permanent, even for Israel. They are eventually completely lifted for the people of God and the covenant community. Jesus lifts the distinctions of clean and unclean foods as early as Mark chapter 7, verses 14 through 23. You can look up his words there, and also very clearly in Acts chapter 10 and 11, where Peter visits Cornelius, we see a lifting of these food laws. And so when we're studying Leviticus chapter 11, we might think, well, can't we just skip it? What exactly is the point? And that's a fair question. So we're going to look at chapter 11 because there is a point, there is a purpose of these instructions, even for us to consider. And so we're going to look at for what, why are these food laws introduced and required for Israel? So for what? What's the purpose? What's so? What exactly are the food laws given in Leviticus chapter 11? And then so what? What does it matter? So what for? What so? And so what? And we'll try to cover at least the first two of those in this lesson. What for? The purpose of the food laws. Well, you can read a lot of literature that suggests that the reason for the food laws is to keep God's people healthy, that he wanted them to eat healthy foods so that they'd be strong and stay away from unhealthy foods. And you see actually a lot of books published today on that topic, Christian books on eating healthy and eating well, because we're concerned about those kinds of things culturally. But that doesn't seem to be the primary concern on the part of the Lord in giving these laws to his people. The main purpose of the food laws, I would argue, was to keep Israel distinct from the people of Canaan. Remember that the people are in the wilderness at Sinai. They are encamped there. They've just received the Ten Commandments. They've just constructed the tabernacle. They've had their inaugural worship service. We read about that in Leviticus chapter 9. We've already talked about that. And here they're continuing to get instructions at Sinai. They'll eventually take up the tabernacle. They'll move toward the promised land. Because of unbelief, the people are not able to enter in right away. And so they wander in the wilderness for 40 years. But then they eventually go into Canaan as the land God has promised to them. And they are to go to war. They are not to assimilate with the people there. They are to drive out the remaining people. They are not to intermarry with them. They are not to adopt their gods. And as a step in that, they're not to adopt their eating practices either. If you're not allowed to eat the same things as people, if you're not allowed to share meals with people, it is an aid in preventing you from being influenced by those beliefs and practices. And that's what's being enacted here by these laws. The Lord is protecting his people from assimilation to the Canaanites with these food prohibitions to prevent them from being influenced by their beliefs and practices, and then subsequently from deeper defilements that go beyond food. Again, just to reiterate this point, it's made far more difficult to develop relationships with people that you are not allowed to eat or drink with. And of course, you eat or drink 2, 3, maybe 4 times a day. And so repeatedly during the day, you are reminded that you are distinct and separate from the people around you. And of course, developing relationships with people through meals was perhaps even more true in ancient cultures. And so to separate at mealtime is a very significant restriction. I still find it interesting that most ethnic peoples have very distinct foods. And I wouldn't argue that this is to keep them distinct from the people around them. It's just to say that there is distinction in foods among people groups. And if one people group was forbidden to share the foods that were common to another people groups, obviously that would go a long way in keeping those people separate. For example, if you weren't allowed to eat flour tortilla shells or beans, obviously assimilation into Latino or Hispanic cultures would be very difficult because you can't share their food. And you're reminded repeatedly on a daily basis, sometimes every 4, 5, 6 hours, that you are different, distinct, and separate from the people around you because you don't share their foods. And in fact, you're not allowed to share meals with them because of food laws. And so let's not assume with our contemporary cultural lens that the food laws we read about in Leviticus 11 are given by the Lord because he's concerned primarily about the health and the fitness from a physiological or biological standpoint. It's more, again, about his spiritual concern for the people and their integrity in walking before him and not adopting the practices of the pagan, unbelieving people in the land in which he is bringing them. So a very, very important point there in understand the purpose of the food laws. Alan P. Ross, in his commentary on Leviticus, puts it this way: by following the law's dietary injunctions, God's people were precluded from assimilation with their pagan neighbors. So just summary there. So what exactly are these food laws, though? What's so in Leviticus chapter 11? How are these categorized? Well, before we get into the specific animals designated as clean and unclean, let's explore a little bit about the proposed reasons for the classifications. And there are a number, like why are certain foods permitted? Why are other foods prohibited? Well, some point to hygiene, that unclean animals were placed in that class because they were not fit for human consumption, because they were more likely to carry disease. And while that is true of some of the animals that were restricted, they were known to carry disease and actually still carry disease, it doesn't fit all of the data. In fact, there's 3 reasons why it seems that this hygienic reason is not the strongest of the proposed reasons. First, it doesn't fit all the data for either what was prohibited or what was allowed. In other words, there were some animals that were likely to carry disease that were actually not prohibited, and there were other animals that were prohibited that don't carry disease, actually. So it doesn't really neatly fit the data if this is the primary reason for the classification. Secondly, the Bible doesn't give this as a reason, so it's speculative on some level. And then 3, Jesus, remember, eventually declares all food clean. And so if hygiene was one of the primary reasons that these foods were not good for people to eat, in fact, they were damaging, unhealthy, could carry disease, it would be odd that sometime later that would be lifted because they would still be unhygienic and carry disease. And so this doesn't seem to be a primary reason for the classification of clean and unclean and the distinction between the two. Another reason could be cultic, meaning that unclean animals were associated with Canaanite deities or practices. And of course, there is warrant to this as well, that some of the foods were rendered unclean. It actually goes back to the point we were talking about before. If the Canaanites could eat certain foods and you couldn't eat those foods, it would separate you from the people. But this point is more about some foods were associated with Canaanite worship and sacrifice, and those animals were prohibited. There are instances of that if you look at detailed lists in Leviticus 11 about the foods that are prohibited and then compare that with Canaanite deity worship and things like that. There is some crossover, but it doesn't fit all of the data neatly either. And so there's some questions about the legitimacy of this as the primary reason for classification between clean and unclean. Some rejecting hygienic and cultic explanations just simply think that the designation is completely arbitrary. And that seems like, well, why would the Lord just arbitrarily prohibit foods for people without having a real clear reason for their prohibition? And part of the answer to that could be we might see something similar. There's different theories on this as well, but we might see something similar in the Garden of Eden, actually, where the Lord allows Adam and Eve to freely eat of any of the trees of the garden except one, the knowledge of good and evil, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And some speculate that maybe there's something wrong with this tree, but many others don't see actually a problem with the tree itself. It just happens to be that specific tree becomes the testing point for Adam and Eve. They're free to eat anything except the Lord has placed a restriction on this one tree. And the question is, will they obey? will they submit to God's law? And so he's reenacting that here in some measure with his people in Israel, saying, you're free to eat a lot of things, but I'm not allowing you to eat this. And so the question is, will you obey? And it might seem unclear to the Israelites and to us, again, why God would classify some foods as clean and allowable and some foods as unclean and prohibited. And while it might seem unclear to us, remember that the Lord tells his people Israel that if the food laws seem arbitrary, so was his election of Israel. Like, why did he choose Israel to be his own people? Was it anything in them? Is it because they were large, prosperous, holy people before he chose them? Absolutely not. It was simply by the mere pleasure of his grace, and according to his will, he set his affection upon them. And as they belong to him, he is allowed to set parameters on all of their life, actually calls them to be holy. And that's one of the things the purity laws show us, is that God claims authority over every area of life, including something as basic as what we eat, the things that we put into our body by way of food and drink. And the question is, will the people obey his will, even if they don't fully understand the reasons for it? And so you might initially think that the explanation that the reason for classification is arbitrary as to be that did not hold much weight. Upon reflection, it's a possible reason for the classification, that it is arbitrary and God just decides that some foods are clean and some foods are unclean. But there probably is a better explanation, actually. And that is, there's this symbolism that's represented in clean and unclean animals. This is something that's proposed by biblical scholar Mary Douglas. Many others have supported the claims that she makes in her work. Gordon Wenham has modified and moved her work forward. But basically, the idea in the symbolic reason is that when things correspond, animals particularly, when things and animals correspond to their order or type, they are pure, healthy, and whole, and therefore they are regarded as clean and can be ingested. But when they don't correspond to their order or type within creation, they are regarded as impure and blemished, and therefore not to be consumed as food. In other words, there is an order or a type that we have with flying creatures, swimming creatures, and walking creatures. According to the way that they're created, there's a certain type or form that they possess. And if any of the animals kind of violate that form or that type, they are classified as unclean because of violating that created kind of order. Again, it doesn't make the animal evil. Animal just means it's not fit to be consumed as food. It's rendered unclean. And so the idea here of the symbolic explanation is that the food laws restricted the people from consuming anomalies, things kind of outside of their classification. For example, to unpack this a little bit, creatures that have no proper or an ambiguous place are forbidden for the people to eat. If you think of amphibians, are they on the land or do they belong to the water? Well, they don't actually fit neatly into either of those classes, and so they are prohibited. They don't fall into the order or the harmony suggested by creation. Creatures that have no proper form, incompletely cloven-footed animals are off limits. Completely split hoof, that's good. Chewing the cud with that's good. Any kind of confusion in that, not good, unclean. Creatures that violate proper locomotion, in other words, water animals that walk. If you think back to swimming animals and corresponding to order or type, swimming animals that have kind of a coat of skin or scales are fine, but those with shells are not fine. Shellfish, obviously, not permitted by Leviticus chapter 11. Many of you know that. But they also would violate proper locomotion. Water animals swim in order to move, except things like lobsters and crabs. They can actually be in the water, but they also walk, which would be more consistent with a land animal. Violation of classification, order, type, unclean. And then finally, creatures that violate the dietary code, showing no respect for life. In other words, animals that were scavengers or carnivores were also off limits because they consume blood. And we'll read later in Leviticus that we as people are not to consume blood, and we're not to consume animals that consume blood, according to the Leviticus dietary laws here. And so those are just some ideas for understanding why we read about the kinds of animals we read about in Leviticus chapter 11 as designated clean or designated unclean. I think there's a lot of warrant to this symbolic reason proposed by Mary Douglas and supported by many others for your consideration. And so if you look at the chapter itself, a summary of classification, we see this also outlined in a different way in Deuteronomy chapter 14, verses 1 through 21. Beginning in verse 2 and going through verse 8, we find the summary of land creatures and identification of clean and unclean land creatures. And by the way, again, this corresponds a little bit to what we see in Genesis, right? The creation order of land animals, and then animals in the sea and animals in the air, not necessarily in that order. But we do see that kind of pattern laid out in the creation account in Genesis, and it's replicated a little bit here in identifying the animals according to their type, classification, unclean, and clean. And so in the first 8 verses, you get a summary of the land animals that could and could not be eaten. Again, cloven-hooved, cud chewing, could be eaten, but all other mammals were considered unclean. Water creatures then are taken up in verses 9 through 12, and we read there a summary of which could and could not be eaten. Only fish with skins and scales could be eaten. So again, water animals that had shells were off limits and regarded as unclean. Flying creatures in verses 13 through 23. We read there a summary basically of which could not be eaten. There's no list of actual clean birds, but a lengthy list of birds that could not be eaten. Many of them were birds of prey, so they could not be eaten. Again, they're scavengers. While flying insects could not be eaten, but hopping insects could. And this might seem a little strange, but again, insects are not technically birds, but they fly. But the hopping ones had a proper form of locomotion because they had a knee joint, if you will. And so grasshoppers could actually be eaten. Locusts could actually be eaten. John the Baptist ate locusts. But other flying insects could not be eaten. All dead animals were unclean except those that were offered for sacrifice and then killed that way. Again, you couldn't offer a dead animal as a sacrifice, but that would be a dead animal, but that wasn't regarded as unclean. But all other dead animals were unclean. To touch a carcass would have been to be unclean as well. And then it goes into swarming creatures in verses 41 through 47 to bring us to an end of the chapter. Swarming creatures were considered unclean. Again, to label an animal unclean scripturally here in Leviticus chapter 11 is not to say that the animal is detestable as it exists. Again, God created these animals, and so they're detestable for food. They're not detestable animals in and of themselves, but they are detestable to be consumed for food. Again, think of the way that we view cats. I know many people who are cat lovers, so they don't think cats are detestable, but if you would for a moment suggest eating cat, they would say, that's detestable to eat a cat. And so that's the way we should think about it. You can also think of certain organs that to eat. Some people like liver, some people don't like liver, but it seems like liver is okay to eat, but it would be detestable to eat a brain. Which again, culturally we have our own notions of what's permissible food to eat and what is prohibited food to eat. Again, may not be related to religious or spiritual reasons, but we have them nevertheless, and that's what we're reading about here in Leviticus 11. But the purpose is that God's people can remain a holy people, separate from Canaanite practices, and eliminating their ability to share meals with the surrounding Canaanite people would have certainly made it harder for them to assimilate into their practices. And so there you get a classification and a categorization of what we see in Leviticus chapter 11. But what are the implications of this for Israel. What do these laws intend to teach Israel about the way they are to live, and what abiding significance do they have for us as the church today? And so we arrive at the so what question, the lesson of the food laws. And so we're going to stop there for today, and we'll pick back up next week looking at the so what of Leviticus chapter 11, the lesson of the food law. So hopefully you'll join us then. See you later.